We're going to see our favorite TV show.
So, I don't know if anyone's actually going to join, but I think we do this.
All right. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti, Amen. Veni Sancte Spiritus, repletuorum cora fidelium, et tui amoris igneis ignem accende, emite spiritum tuum creabuntur. Oremus Deus e cora fidelium, Sancti Spiritus illustratione docovisti, da nobis in iodem spiritu recta sapere et eius semper consolatione gaudere, per Christum Dominum nostrum.
Amen.
Sede sapientiae,
Ora pro nobis.
Omni Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. All right, we're talking about the use of force. Page 194. Coercive power of the church, is it extended to temporal punishments? So we're in the objections. This is objection to the power which produces a cruel inhumanity is itself evil, but the power by which the church would be able to inflict force produces per se inhumanity. This is evident from the various nefarious crimes of the Inquisition. And we're on the instance number 4927. The coercive acts of the church, if it should prevail, would bring a great number of heretics in danger of temporal punishments. Response: I deny the antecedent. What is objected here is entirely off the subject. The church indeed deems it unlawful to place the various forms of divine worship on the same footing as the true religion, but does not on that account condemn those rulers who, for the sake of securing some great good or of hindering some great evil, allow patiently custom or usage to be a kind of sanction for each kind of religion having its place in the state. So Leo XIII defended toleration of false religions in a Catholic state. And in fact, the church is wont to take earnest heed that no one shall be forced to embrace the Catholic faith against his will, for as St. Augustine wisely reminds us, man cannot believe otherwise than of his own will. See, so that's yes, that's a quote, yes, of Leo XIII. Where is the beginning? So that the church has always upheld the legitimacy of toleration, but there must be a sufficient reason to tolerate. And that's either to avoid a greater evil or to achieve a greater good. So in a very mixed, a society which is very mixed with regard to religions, yes, there would ordinarily be a toleration. Something like the Russian Empire, before the revolution, even after, they have a lot of Muslims and whatnot. They had Catholics, they were tolerated. Also, Asian Russia, I'm sure this has various religions and all. So, something that has a huge spread of real estate would typically have a lot of different religions in it. Besides heresy, although it is evil in itself, it does not now invade peoples, but rather is established among us, and because of a regrettable heredity of errors, quite a few are believed to err in good faith. See, so that would be true of many Protestants, etc. They err in good faith because it's handed down. You're born into it. It's not something that you revolted, did or achieved by revolution against the Catholic faith, as they would have in the the Renaissance and Reformation. Objection 3. If the right to coerce through temporal punishments were in the church, Christ would have given to the church a material power to exercise that right, but the church lacks material power. I distinguish the major. Christ would have given to the church a material power to be exercised either by the church itself or by others for the church, I concede. Only to be exercised by the church itself, I deny. The church does not have material power formally, let it pass. That means we'll talk about that for now. Virtually, I deny. I apply this to whatever case in which it must be said that it is considered to have a material force formally or immediately joined to itself. But certainly it has virtually a material force. That is, it has the right to appropriate to itself those through whom it might exercise that power. Concerning the fathers of the third, concerning this, the fathers of the Third Council of the Lateran, late 12th century, I believe, in chapter 27 said, although the ecclesiastical discipline contained in the judgments of the priest does not effect cruel judgments, nevertheless, cruel punishments, nevertheless, by the constitutions of Catholic rulers, it is aided in such a way that often men seek a salutary remedy when they fear that a corporal punishment might come upon them. See, so typically the Inquisition merely decided whether someone was guilty of heresy or not. See, and then if they were handed over to the secular power. See, and the secular power carried out the various punishments. And as I said, heresy was considered the same as treason, so that's why there was a capital punishment for heresy in the Middle Ages. It was considered to be contrary to the very essence of the nation. See, so so question 12, the relations between church and state. So this we do to a certain extent, to a great extent actually, in Catholic political philosophy, but we'll talk about it here too. So Article 1, what systems there are concerning relations between church and state? The first is that which wants the church to be subject to the state. The second is that which separates the church from the state. The third teaches that the church has some power over the state. The system of those who subordinate the church to the state. The theory of the Roman Empire concerning the Christian religion was, non licet esse vos, it is not permitted for you to exist. The practice was sacrifica aut morere, sacrifice or die, meaning sacrifice to the gods or die. Because those were the state gods that protected Rome, supposedly. So you were... all peoples took religion very, very seriously and took it as an integral part of their society up until the American Constitution. See, and that was the effect of all of the liberal thinking of the 18th century, particularly of John Locke and others in France, but also in England. But it started in England. The liberal thinking, Hobbes, in the middle of the 1600s. The idea that religion should be a purely private thing, that this has really nothing to do with the state. See? And so the first time that was incorporated into politics, you might say, or statehood, it was in the colonies. Well, actually, I shouldn't say that. The colonies were very, very careful, when they were colonies, to impose or to establish their own religions and to be very intolerant of Catholicism. The Puritans wanted nothing to do with, and that was Massachusetts and all of New England. I mean, they were dead against Catholicism, dead. As a matter of fact, they're called Puritans because they wanted to purify the Anglican Church of its Catholicism. That's how bad they were. So Massachusetts and the rest of the people around them were all very, very anti-Catholic. And in the South, toward the South, you had the Anglicans, who also were very anti-Catholic. Even up to the 1980s, in order to obtain a license in Virginia to do a wedding, you had to, if you were out of state, you had to pay $700. And that was a holdover from the time in which Virginia did not want the Catholic priests from Maryland coming in and doing anything religious in Virginia. So $700 at that time would have been a fortune. So I don't know if it's still true. But you see, with the thinking that came in was that, well, we will leave to the states whatever religions they want, but the federal government will not make any statement about religion. You're up to because the federal government was supposed to be weak, and the colonies or the states at that time would have their own. They could do whatever they wanted. But the problem is that the states also adopted religious liberty in their constitutions, so that the whole country became one of religious indifferentism. See, that's really the first time in the history of the world that you would have that. I mean, Egyptians, Greeks, everybody had a religion, and you had to adhere to that religion. Otherwise, you were out. And that makes sense in this that the most important aspect of your life is your death. Whereas they had a sense of their gods being, directing and protecting the state, which is true in the sense that the true God does all of those things, and that's why there should be a public worship of the true God. See, so but I mean, they had some religious sense that there was something divine that protected the state, and that everyone had to worship those deities in order to be good citizens. That was integral to all societies. I mean, the idea of for example, even in England, if you didn't go to the Anglican Church on Sunday, the police would come around. As late as the 18th century, you had to practice. They don't do that anymore. Those churches are practically empty now. Anglicanism is virtually dead. So anyway, that's just a little background on this. So when peace was accorded to the church by the Emperor Constantine in 313 through the Edict of Milan, the Christian peoples for 1,000 years professed that it was necessary that the terrestrial kingdom be the handmaid of the celestial one, although in practice this was not observed by some princes. So Christendom, that is from Constantine to the Renaissance, reigned with that idea, is that the church was the superior entity, and the state, although not subservient to the church, nonetheless recognized the church and conformed to what was necessary for Christian life, you might say. So in the 14th century, William of Ockham, who was the inventor of nominalism, John of Giandone, and Marsilius of Padua, who was a heretic, began to put forth the idea of the hegemony of the state, civil state, over the church as a right and a true order of things. Marsilius of Padua propagated this in his work Defensor Pacis. And you see, that will make Protestantism very popular, because the local lords think, well, now I don't have to deal with the church anymore. I am the head of the church in my little principality. I'm talking about Germany particularly. That's one of the big reasons why Protestantism was so popular was that the princes supported it. The rule of Protestantism is this: cuius regio elius et religio, whose region it is, his also is the religion. So Germany was split up in that way. So if you might know that the Holy Roman Empire was a collection of a lot of little princedoms. Something about the size of one of the counties in Pennsylvania. Just small princedoms, and it's just a big puzzle, you might say, of all of those things. So that was very appealing to them. Count Frederick III made the inhabitants of the Palatinate, that's western central Germany on the border of France. In Germany, Calvinists from Lutherans, then Ludwig turned the same ones back into Lutherans, and Frederick IV turned them back into Calvinists because they were changing religions as need be. So as the ruler changed religion, then everybody else had to change religion. As a matter of fact, the very term Protestant comes from the fact that those embracing Luther's reform would not permit religious liberty to Catholics, so they protested against a rule of one of the diets. That means a council. They protested against religious liberty for Catholics. That's how they get the term Protestants. In England, under the reign of Henry VIII and Elizabeth, and in Parliament in the year 1456, there was no ecclesiastical jurisdiction except through the king, under the king, and from the king. So he was it. The doctrine, however, of the subordination of the church in worship and discipline was called by many, especially in England, Erastianism, from Thomas Erasto, a Calvinist, the proponent of this doctrine. That means he died in 1587. That is not a cross, that's a dagger. And it indicates that somebody died in that time. However, the power of the state over religion is called the right of reforming the exercise of the religion and the majestic right concerning sacred things. For many years, a title was sought by theologians for this fictitious right, and three were concocted: the episcopal system, the territorial system, and the collegial system. According to the episcopal system, jurisdiction first belonged to the bishops, but their right was suspended through the Peace of Augsburg, that's in southern Germany, which was the kind of truce, so to speak, between the Protestants and the Catholics, and was conferred upon the civil prince with regard to exercise. So the civil prince became the little king over the church, but the status of suspension was made definitive. Hence, the right of the prince was a devolved power. The author of this system was Matthew Stephani. He died in 1646 on his tract on jurisdiction. In the territorial system, a right concerning sacred things is attributed to the prince, not by a devolution from the bishops, but because the church is functioning in the territory of the state, which is governed by the prince. So says Thomasius vom Rechte eines Fürsten in Mitteldingen, concerning the rights of a prince in literally middle things, probably church and state. Vindicia Juris, the vindication of the right of the king, the majesty right or majestic right with regard to sacred things. And J.H. Boehme, his dissertation on the right of a bishop, of the bishops of the right of the episcopal right of princes, of evangelical princes. That means evangelical means Protestant. The juridical right, the episcopal right of evangelical princes. Not very far from this era is Karpzov, etc., which claims that in the beginning jurisdiction was with the princes and then was taken by the bishops. The collegial system consists in this, that the right of the prince over sacred things pertains to him as a delegated right. It is delegated to him by the communities or by the church, which is only an association whose members are equal. So this is all Protestant ecclesiology, you might say. You see, the church is invisible for Protestants. The only thing visible are these communities that people form. They make churches, they buy churches, they build churches. But that the church is something invisible. That's the Protestant principle. For this association of men, who are distinct by no hierarchical grade, although it was the primordial subject of ecclesiastical jurisdiction, transfers the right over sacred things to the prince. So this was the case in all Protestantism. Therefore, from this source, the civil power has collegial rights over sacred things. In other words, the rights of bishops. Furthermore, there is attributed to the prince, in virtue of his principality, a right over sacred things. The collegial system, of which Pufendorf poured the foundations, was elaborated by Christian Pfaff, who died in 1760. See, Gallicanism, Jansenism, Febronianism, and Josephism. Gallicanism is the idea that the French had, that the French church had certain privileges, and that one of them was to effectively sift the decisions of the Roman Pontiff and to see if they would be applicable in France. See, that's Gallicanism. Louis XIV was the big Gallican, but that continued with the Bourbons all the way through. Through Louis XV, Louis XVI, and then was revived when the monarchy came back in 1814, when the Bourbons came back. So that was the Gallicanism. So if the government decided that something coming from Rome was not in accordance with their thoughts, it was forbidden for the bishops to publish it. Jansenism is what is known as Catholic Protestantism, and that also was flourishing under the reign of Louis XIV in France. Particularly, it was Calvinism with Catholic trappings. Febronianism, Febronius was the pseudonym of a prince bishop in Germany. He called himself Febronius because his girlfriend was Febronia. I think we talked about him earlier. Josephism comes from the Emperor Joseph II, who was a Freemason of Austria, and he interfered with the church a great deal. How many candles you could light for benediction, for example. The other monarchs called him Joseph the Sacristan. So he was always dabbling in this sort of thing. Hold that even in Catholic kingdoms, no small part that should be, of the ecclesiastical government is conceded to the political power. For this reason, the system of indirect negative power over sacred things arose, which power is usually called the majestic power over sacred things. By some, it is said that this right pertains to the very royal power itself, and that it is so deeply connected with it that the prince cannot abdicate the power over the church unless he were to also abdicate the royal power. In other words, it was part and parcel of the royal power. To this right is also referred, one, the right of advocacy and of protection, by which the state, in establishing the ministers of religion and in educating seminarians, and in promoting religious orders, is exercising its proper right. The right of supreme dominion over ecclesiastical goods, which was a title to confiscate the possessions of the church. The right of reforming, which is the right of princes to extirpate abuses which may have occurred in the church, and of urging the observance of the canons. So instead of leaving to the church the right of having its own courts and making its own punishments with regard to evildoers, the state got involved in that. For the right of supreme inspection, which subjects ecclesiastical discipline and the whole exterior activity of the church to the administration of the state. So the state could come around and see if the monks are doing what they should be doing, for example. And so the state had its hand even in those things. 5, the right of preventing, which blocks the operation of the church by preventive laws in order to make sure that the church does not harm the state. 6, the right of placet and of exequatur, which is a power attributed to the civil majesty to prohibit the publication of bulls, encyclicals, and other ecclesiastical acts, and of examining them in a civil court before they can be approved for execution. That was France. 7, the right of appeal as if from an abuse, that is, a right by which the state clearly, as the superior judge, admits in ecclesiastical affairs appeals from a sentence from an ecclesiastical judge and recourse to a prince. See, so you could appeal from an ecclesiastical court. And you see, today we don't understand it, but there were many things that were judged by ecclesiastical courts, particularly any crimes of the clergy. They were, by the understanding with the state, that they would be tried and punished by, or exonerated, as the case may be, by the ecclesiastical courts. That was known as exemption. And when you got tonsured, you were exempt. So that came even with tonsure. False opinions of this type were spread about in the 14th century and became fixed in the minds by the pragmatic sanction. So look at that. That's a famous thing in history. The pragmatic sanction of Bourges, which is central France, issued by King Charles VII of France on July 7, 1438, required a general church council with authority superior to that of the Pope to be held every 10 years, required election rather than appointment to ecclesiastical offices, prohibited the Pope from bestowing and profiting from benefices, and limited appeals to Rome. So you see, this is recognize and resist. See, well, he's the Pope, but his powers are very much restricted. That's why the French don't have much trouble with recognize and resist, because they have a history of this stuff. The Gallican Church declared administrative independence from the Church of Rome, suppressed the payment of annates to Rome. That means contributions to Rome to keep the lights on, and forbade papal intervention in the appointment of French prelates. So the king would decide who were the prelates would be. See, and that led to a lot of abuse. There were many prelates who had women on the side and everything. I mean, it was just common because the king wanted people that wanted his buddies in there. And there's a famous quote of Louis XVI. I probably told you this. When the Archbishop of Paris died, somebody suggested to him to appoint the Archbishop of Toulouse, and his response was, well, I think it would be appropriate if the Archbishop of Paris believed in God. That's what he said. Indicating that the Archbishop of Toulouse did not believe in God, or at least seemed not to. Louis, for all of his faults, was a religious man, and he I think is making a point. While this did result in a loss of papal power in France, the movement of conciliarists itself was divided. In 1449, the Council of Basel, it's now Switzerland, was dissolved and the conciliar movement came to an end. See that in the Great Western Schism, there was a council in Constance, which is now in Germany, and that was effectively running the church because there were two doubtful popes, or at least seemingly doubtful popes. And then a third one was elected in Pisa, and so then nobody accepted him. So there were three doubtful popes, except maybe Pisa. But so that's the Council of Constance finally elected Martin V, and everybody accepted him as the pope. But there was a conciliarist movement. The council then moved to Basel, and that is considered to be totally invalid. It was condemned by the church, Basel. So that's the pragmatic sanction. It's important to understand that because it's very much a part of recognize and resist. And had not a few defenders, among them Pitou, Les Libertés de l'Église Gallicane Dupuis, Febronius, Ibel. He was active in Austria. He put out a tract just before the arrival of Pius VI in Vienna, claiming that all the rights of the Austrian state over the church. He also said that bishops, by their very consecration, have jurisdiction. It's Vatican II. Payham, the Congress of Ems in 1786, the Synod of Pistoia in 1786, Newts Dov Bluntschli, the German Hinsius, and Friedberg. That means Peace Mountain. All right. If you see that li on the end of a word in German, that's a sign of Switzerland. Germans generally don't have that li on the end. That's typically Swiss. So, Hegelianism. There's Friedrich Hegel, who was a nut, infected with the depravity of pantheism, asserts that the state is the divine will, the göttliche Wille. See, this will influence Hitler. The state is it, which as a present spirit unfolds itself in a real form and in the organization of a world. See, that's that German romantic thinking, and like a super state, and the state is everything. Don't forget that was Nazism is National Socialism. It's not a right-wing thing. It's very much a left-wing thing. It's National Socialism. And Goebbels always said that whenever he said National Socialism, he accented the second word because he was a socialist, actually a communist. Born a Catholic and raised a Catholic. Goebbels. It's from the Rhineland. This state is an absolute end unto itself. Selbstzweck. Selbst means self, and Zweck means purpose or end. So a self-end. And is the ultimate end of each man. Endzweck. End means end, obviously it's Zweck. So the state is the ultimate end of each man. You can see all of the basis of socialism and communism in that. The state is the source of all rights. All religion is subjective. The state is objective. It knows, it wills, it rules. Hence the state absorbs all things, including religion itself. Grundlinien der Philosophie des Rechts, the ground lines, literally, of the philosophy of right. See how useful German is? Teach it if you want. This system consists, therefore, in denying the rights of God and any order whatsoever to future goods. Precursors of this statolatry, so that means idolatry of the state, and Caesaropapism, that means where the government becomes the pope, where Thomas Hobbes, who was awful, and you see him right there, in his book The Citizen, and in Leviathan, and Spinoza, who was an excommunicated Jew, he was Portuguese, excommunicated for his heresy in Portugal, and then also in Holland, where he went, in the work entitled Tractatus Theologico-Politicus. Leo XIII in his encyclical Libertas, and that's how you pronounce that. The accent is on the second syllable, not libertas, but libertas, describes the statolatrical mentality of many modern people with these words: they aggrandize the power of the civil government to such an extent as to subject the Church of God to the empire and sway of the state, like any voluntary association of citizens. So the system of those who separates state from church and church from state. In this system, the spiritual and temporal orders are dissociated, and separation is considered to be the due state of things, the way it ought to be, which in itself corresponds to the right order of each power. Those who adhere to this error say that they think in this manner because the state and the church are to each other as two alien powers, even some saying inimical, in other words, that they are enemies to each other. Leo XIII describes the nature of this idea with these words: many wish the state to be separated from the church wholly and entirely, so that with regard to every right of human society, in institutions, customs, and laws, the offices of the state, and the education of youth, they would pay no more regard to the church than if she did not exist, and at most would allow the citizens individually to attend their religion in private if so minded. Against such as these, all the arguments by which this is still Leo XIII, disprove the principle of separation of church and state are conclusive, with this superadded, that it is absurd that the citizen should respect the church while the state may hold her in contempt. So the system of separation is recognized in Machiavelli's The Prince, who reduced the place of morality to such a low state that it was permitted to the civil power to care nothing about the moral law except its utility. Immanuel Kant, since he had set down in his Critique of Pure Reason the principles from which it would follow that there can be had no knowledge concerning the existence of God, in other works he separated the moral from religion and the juridical order from the moral order, in such a way that he destroyed the foundations of an ordered connection of both powers. How can you make a law without morality? In our time, Cavour was the agitator in Turin for the Freemason for the unification of Italy, which was a totally Masonic and anti-Catholic movement. He was active in the middle of the 19th century. Gave a new formula to an old error: a free church in a free state. I'm sorry to say, but the first one to say that was Bishop England of Charleston, North Carolina, in the 1830s. It's in there. See, that came from the United States. And the reason it did was that you see, the Catholics thought, well, this is great. Nobody's persecuting us. You see, in Europe, it's all forms of persecution, and the state is all involved with, and suppressing the Catholic Church. And Here it's, you can breathe easy. You can just go to church as you will. See, so they put this on a pedestal as being the ideal. In general, naturalists and rationalists, if they wished to avoid the doctrine of subjugating the church to the state, fell into the system of the dissociation of each power. So Thomas Jefferson said there should be a wall of separation between the church and state. The system of those who teach that there is a certain power of the church over the state. The Catholics profess that the state is in a certain way subordinated to the church, but not all are in agreement about the nature of the subordination. There are three positions. The first holds that there is a direct power of the church over the state. The second, a directive power. The third, an indirect power. Direct power is said to be that in which states are subjected to ecclesiastical authority, not only in spiritual things, but also with regard to the affairs of the states, which are temporal by reason of itself, and that this is by the institution of Christ. So that is to say that the church can direct everything in the state. From this, they conclude that the civil power is derived in the secular prince through a due and subalternate emanation from the Roman pontiff. Among those who held this were John of Salisbury in his Polycraticus, Augustinus Triumphus of Ancona in his De Potestate Ecclesiastica, and others. But there are a few doctors who promoted direct power in the Middle Ages. So that is not really considered in other words, where the Pope is a supreme emperor directing all states and all political power emanates from him. That was not defended by many. They are thought to have considered their system to mean that the exercise of the civil power pertains to princes by divine ordination. Directive power. The promoters of this system think that no jurisdiction and coercive power over temporal things has been given to the church by God, but only that power which is exercised by teaching and exhorting. They teach, however, that the Roman pontiffs, having exceeded the limits of this direction, have attained, either by a special title or by a peculiar possession or by a positive human law, but not by divine law, the power of doing these things. Fénelon, famous figure in the 17th century France, seems to follow this opinion, and Gosselin in his Pouvoir du Peuple au Moyen Âge. He, in explaining those things which the Roman pontiffs did in the Middle Ages, used only a historical system, as he says, that is, the public law of that time, setting aside entirely a theological system which recognizes in many of the acts of the pontiffs even a divine right. So the indirect power is said to be that which is not primarily and within the limits of the same power, but is because of something else and is over a distinct power. But this indirect power of the church in temporal things is that by which temporal things are subject to the church, not by reason of themselves, but inasmuch as they are referred to the end of religion. So what there is in the state that touches religion, you might say. Morality, for example, laws that concern moral transgenderism, for example, that touches on the property of the church, you might say. So whereas tariffs would not. I mean, you could say that tariff is just or unjust, but that really doesn't concern the church in itself. In this system, therefore, the church has the power of jurisdiction over spiritual things, principaliter, and over temporal things, secondarily, as if a consequence, and by reason of their connection with spiritual things, or as they say, by reason of sin. This seems to be the position of St. Augustine, of Innocent III, early part of the 1200s, St. Thomas Aquinas, and elsewhere. John of Torquemada exposes the system of indirect power in 7 chapters of Book 2 in the Summa de Ecclesia. There were 2 Torquemadas. One was the Inquisitor, I forget his first name, then there was one who was just a theologian. They were brothers. All right, so don't get them confused. And refutes the position of those who defend that there is no power and of those who assert that the church has direct power over temporal things. The very term indirect seems to be indicated by him where he expresses his mind with these words: the Roman pontiff, although he does not have power regularly or directly, which is plenary over temporal things, as it is in spiritual things, nevertheless he has the power over temporal things as a consequence, and this by his proper right, namely to the extent that it is necessary for the preservation of spiritual things. Bellarmine is also an excellent defender of indirect power in his Tractatus de Potestate Summi Pontificis against Berkeley, that's a British philosopher of the say the 1600s, and they pronounce it Barclay. Why the British pronounce it Barclay, I will never know. They also pronounce C-L-E-R-K as Clark. The Americans, for whatever they might lack in accent, at least pronounce correctly the various English words and according to the way they are spelled. So if they wanted to have Clark, why don't they have C-L-A-R-K? C-L-E-R-K, it does not mean Clark. Right, so, but that's English for you. So that's Barclay. You pronounce it Barclay. You want to sound educated. All right, so those are the systems, all right? So Article 2, the principles by which the question between church and state must be solved. So this touches on the Vatican II religious liberty. So I think we'll quit there today. So today is 1/13/26. There's Immanuel Kant. He is the equivalent, what Thomas Aquinas is to scholastic philosophy, he is to modern philosophy. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti, amen. Sub tuum praesidium confugimus sancta Dei genitrix nostras deprecationis et despicias in necessitatibus, sed a periculis cunctis libera nos semper, virgo glorios et benedicta. Amen. Nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti, amen. It didn't cross my mind. Yeah, I'll screw about it, bro.
It wasn't back here.
It's sad that that is where we're at.
Yeah, it is sad.
In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti, Amen. Veni, Sancti Spiritus Reflectorum, corda fidelium et tui amoris in signum accende, miti Spiritum tuum et creabuntur. Oremus Deus, qui corda fidelium, Sancti Spiritus illustratione cubisti, donavisione iodem Spiritu recta sapere, et de eius semper consolatione godere, per Christum Dominum nostrum. Sede sapientiae. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti, Amen. So, in reviewing the material for this conference, I decided the best thing to do would be to backtrack a little, just to keep things in mind the context of what we were talking about during that last conference before the vacation, which was, well, almost a month ago now, at least the last one that I gave. May have even been the last conference before vacation at all. In any case, I'm going to be backing up a little bit. So if you remember what we're saying here, then that's good, because these are things that need to be remembered. But if not, that's okay, because we'll be reviewing them to get the context of the point at which we were. So if some of this sounds a little familiar, as in hearing in the last conference, then yes, in fact, that's the case. But these are definitely things that bear repeating anyway. Things that ought to be reviewed regularly, kept fresh in the mind. And this, once again, is from St. Pius X's Errant Animo from 1908. So he says, St. Pius X says, in this exhortation, it is not your personal welfare that we are striving to secure, but the common welfare of Catholic peoples, the one that cannot be separated from the other. For the priest cannot be good or bad for himself alone. His conduct and his way of life have far-reaching consequences for the people. So most definitely, the priest has an obligation, a serious one, to strive for personal perfection in the spiritual life. Authors say it would be a mortal sin for the priest to resolve not to do that. Such is the obligation on priests, which is actually, even authors explain this as well, is actually a higher obligation. There's a stricter obligation upon the priest, whether he's religious priest, secular priest, meaning a priest of a diocesan priest, that there's still whatever state he is, whatever his apostolate is, whether he's living the contemplative religious life, the priest has a stricter obligation to strive for perfection than even any lay religious, even in the case of a lay religious in the contemplative state, as opposed to a secular priest who's just living in a rectory, working in a parish. Just by virtue of the priesthood alone, that obligation is stricter. And remember that the religious life is theoretically the theory is that's just the regular Christian spiritual life, just lived to its fullest perfection. That's the idea. That is why people enter the religious life, for that purpose. And so even those who they're not priests, but who have just decided to make that the sole focus of their lives, that even so the obligation upon them is less than it is upon priests, even who are not in a religious order. So that is the gravity of the obligation upon the priest to strive for perfection in the spiritual life. And again, as St. Pius X is saying, that it's not for himself alone, that it's not for the sake of the priest alone. That in order to provide for the good of other souls, he has to provide for his own. And of course, that remains true, even, of course, given the fact that the sacraments work ex opere operato, that they work grace all on their own, even aside from the holiness of the one who administers them. So the minister could even be in the state of sin and actually committing sacrilege in administering it, but if the one who receives it isn't sinning in any way, is receiving it worthily, the sacrament worthily, then that person still derives benefit from it. So then that most definitely the sacraments work ex opere operato. They produce the effect just from the very act done, and in someone who is they're valid, just from the act done, matter, form, intention posited by a valid minister upon someone who is able to receive it. And but that doesn't change the fact that the priest will not derive any benefit from them himself, from the administering or the receiving of the sacraments, who is of course not providing for his own spiritual life, and meaning striving towards perfection in it. Because once again, his conduct and way of life have far-reaching consequences for the people. So it's we can look at the illustration is imagine being presented, let's say, with some kind of a gift, some kind of say a chalice, a magnificent chalice, all done up in gold and precious stones and everything, but the person presenting it is a complete mess. The chalice in this case representing the sacraments, but the person is completely disheveled, filthy, smelly, just absolutely repulsive in his personal comportment. But the thing being handed to you is a magnificent chalice. That's no less magnificent for that fact. But the overall experience of receiving that is most definitely less than it would otherwise be if the person were well put together. That's the difference between the sacraments being administered by a priest who is worthily administering them and the one who is unworthily administering them. So, of course, there is a range, I might say, of being worthy. Some are most definitely better disposed at a higher state in the spiritual life, at a higher degree of the state of grace than others are. And some are maybe at a very low ebb, to the point that they are, as the term is usually used, sacramental machines. In other words, administering the sacraments validly and, in fact, lawfully, not being in a state of sin, but also that's about it. That their personal lives are not a source of any kind of particular edification. Maybe not of any scandal, not of any particular scandal, but also neither of any particular edification. And then the goal, of course, is that the priest should not only carry out his functions, and just be at the bare minimum to carry them out, but to be always advancing in perfection, because there is no such thing as standing still in the spiritual life. That's true for everybody, and most definitely for the priest. If he's not advancing, he's slipping back, ultimately towards mortal sin. He's either advancing towards sainthood or slipping back towards mortal sin. And that's, of course, for those who are actually in the state of grace. For anybody in the state of grace, that holds true. Hence the obligation to be constantly advancing. So a truly good priest is an immense gift wherever he may be. And that's true. You can see that very easily from countless examples of saints throughout the history of the church, priests and bishops. And you can also see the exact opposite, that even just one bad priest can undo a great deal of good done by many good priests. Pick any example you want, but any of the heresiarchs, I mean, not necessarily any of them, they weren't all priests, but many of them were, or at least in orders. So the heretic Arius was a deacon, as I recall, for example. It's still very close to the priesthood. And Martin Luther was a priest. There have been other, and then the Arian heresy itself, to go back to that, many bishops just went along with the heresy. Should have taken a stand, but just didn't. Therefore, we will, this is St. Pius X, we will begin this exhortation by stimulating you to that sanctity of life which the dignity of your office demands. Anyone who exercises the priestly ministry exercises it not for himself alone, but for others. And then he quotes St. Paul to the Hebrews, "For every high priest taken from among men is ordained for men and the things that appertain to God, that he may offer up gifts and sacrifices for sins." And this, of course, brings to mind the fact that the vocation is, once again, a gratia gratis data, not given for the sake of the priest himself. And if he carries out the functions of the priesthood well, that is a source of very great merit, certainly. And the more perfectly carries them out, the more greatly he merits, because they're not easy functions. It's not easy to carry out the functions of the priesthood well. Any priest who has been well trained and makes an effort to say Mass well will tell you that that is a difficult thing to do. To say a low Mass every day. That's a difficult thing to do. Now, you should do anything that you do frequently, obviously there's going to be a tendency due to the effects of original sin to become sloppy about it. And it's just very difficult to say Mass well to begin with in the first place. When you begin to study it, it seems it's something you don't even really think of before you get to the point of studying how to say Mass. You just think it's very natural. Priests just say Mass. That's what they do. And you don't really think about what goes into it. But when you get to the point of having to learn how to do it, that's very difficult to do it well. To do it validly is not difficult. To do it, to observe the rubrics as they must be observed in every little respect, that is difficult. It takes a great deal of energy and focus to do it. As you find out once you get to just practicing to say Mass, how many things that there are that all come together. So many actions that are very precisely laid out, along with prayers that have to be recited from memory while performing them, and sometimes exact words corresponding to exact actions, and all of that having to come together and keep it moving. It has to be kept flowing nicely, because as apparently the ideal low Mass is 25 minutes long. That's how the idea is that the celebrants should know everything so perfectly should know Latin well enough, obviously, and have all the actions and all the prayers of the Mass so down so well, as they say, that it should take no more than 25 minutes to get through a low Mass. Now that's excluding the Leonine prayers and distribution of Holy Communion, but still, 25 minutes. That's the ideal. And you see that's quite fast. Some priests, you might think, say Mass quickly. Probably not that quickly. That's fast. And it's difficult to do that. But definitely the idea is that's something to strive for, to get to the point of being that proficient, not rushing through it. St. Alphonsus does say that, on the other hand, to say Mass in less than 15 minutes would be a grave sin. It would be necessary to rush through it so fast to get through it in a quarter of an hour or less, that St. Alphonsus says that there's no way you'd be excused from grave sin by title of scandal. Now, I don't know how it would be physically possible anyway to do that. It would be an absolute mess, certainly, if you were to attempt it. So just try to say Mass well. Things will tend to, if anything, things will go on a little bit longer than they should, as opposed to not as long. But realistically, if the Mass is a low Mass, or daily low Mass is somewhere between 30 to 45 minutes, is probably nothing seriously wrong. Probably. Anything longer than that, you'd think, okay, the celebrant probably doesn't really know how to say Mass very well if he's taking that long to get through it. But anything less, 25 minutes, you'd be impressed, very impressed. Anything less than that, you think, okay, he's rushing, probably. Just all those things to keep in mind. So, indeed, the priest exercises the priesthood not for himself but for others. He can merit well, and indeed very greatly, by carrying out those functions as he ought. But he was not given that vocation for the purpose of simply accruing personal merit, but for the sake of other souls. So keep in mind that gratiae gratis date, graces, of course all graces are given by God freely, but this particular type of grace is for others that fall under the same heading are, say, saints who have been seen levitating, so that people would be would notice that, and would therefore be would clearly be led to understand that they are to pay attention to what this person is saying. This person is clearly of great holiness, and pay attention to what this person is saying. So St. Teresa of Avila received gratiae gratis date, so people understand that she has a unique insight. She's been gifted with insights into the spiritual life. Pay attention to what she says on the spiritual life. So grace of vocation to the priesthood falls into the same heading as that. In other words, that's not given to that saint. For example, levitating is not given to a saint so that he can be vain about it, obviously. In fact, saints are, when they get those kinds of graces, they're very greatly embarrassed by it because of their humility. Saints who work miracles, you read that they become very, they find it very embarrassing that miracles be worked at their own touch, because they have a sense of they know very well there's the power of God doing that, but they don't like having attention being drawn to themselves on that occasion. Of course, God wants attention to be drawn to them, but it often happens that there's a kind of struggle. You see it time and again in the lives of the saints, kind of almost a struggle, not a true one, but that there's many times saints go through something of a crisis when it becomes clear to them what the will of God is for them versus what they themselves want. You see that time and again. So God wants to shine a spotlight on this person because of the sanctity that God has granted that person. That can do, realizing that can do a great deal of good for other souls. But that person, because of his humility, doesn't want that to happen. So then, of course, there's something of a conflict, not a true conflict, but something of a struggle. And then the saint, of course, always ends up, and one who got canonized, of course, ends up submitting to the will of God, but it's a very difficult thing for a truly humble person to undergo something like that. So, vocation of a priesthood given to the priest, given to him who receives it, of course, has to prepare himself well for the priesthood. That doesn't make that job any easier. Makes it possible. It gives the drive necessary to get through all of those years of preparation and training and so forth. But it doesn't make that to be easy. Certainly not. So Christ himself taught that lesson when he compared the priest to salt and light in order to show the nature of the priestly ministry. The priest then is the light of the world and the salt of the earth. Everyone knows that he fulfills this function chiefly by the teaching of the Christian truth, and who can be unaware that this ministry of teaching is practically useless, meaning in the practical order. In Latin, practice means, you could translate that into English as practically, but it really means more in the practical order with regard to practice. This ministry of teaching is useless in the practical order if the priest fails to confirm by the example of his life the truths which he teaches. Yes, the most important function of the priesthood is the offering of the Mass. There is no higher action on earth, as I've said it before. St. Alphonsus points out that our Lord himself performed no action on earth more important than that. Just consider all of the miracles worked by our Lord. All of those miracles. Still, the most important thing he did was the offering of the sacrifice of the Mass, and of course also the sacrifice on Calvary, the exact same sacrifice on Calvary in a bloody manner. We can consider all of those miracles in the Gospels. The Mass is more important than any of those. And that is the power given to the priest to do every day. Even on some occasions, there's even justification to offer the Mass more than once a day. By nation on Sundays, for example. I mean, hard to justify it outside of a Sunday ordinarily, but it's sometimes permitted. Sometimes some priests even do that very regularly on Sundays, offer two or three Masses. In the earlier days of the traditional movement, you might have priests would go around. There were very few priests, and had to cover many places, and so they ended up saying multiple Masses on Sundays. So that can happen. So those who hear him, the priest, might say insultingly, "It is true, but not without justification." They profess that they know God, but in their works they deny him. They will refuse to accept his teaching and will derive no benefit from the light of the priest. So, in other words, a priest might say everything right, might present the doctrines of the faith correctly, might present divine revelation accurately, both with regard to the doctrines of faith and moral teachings. But if in his own life that's not reflected, his own belief in those things is not reflected, then why would he expect to find anyone else to accept them and also then thereafter to reflect their belief in those things in their own lives? Clearly, there's no reason why. And of course, people should be able to look past that. The life of a priest who is less than ideal should be able to look past that and follow the example of our Lord with regard to the Jews who were alive at his time, to do what they say, not what they do. In other words, they were saying the right things, but they were, of course, living. They were actually, in their lives, they were whited sepulchres, as our Lord called them. At least not all of them, but the scribes and the Pharisees, certainly our Lord's enemies, that they were definitely whited sepulchres, which means they're looking very nice on the outside, but full of dead man's bones inside, of course, referring to state of sin, dead through sin on the inside. So, with regard to those bad leaders that were around when he was, and we've been hearing about them in the readings at table, just how bad they really were. It's incredible. So how disgusting things they did. But our Lord said, when they're exercising, when they're speaking to the truth, you do what they say, not what they do. So people should be able to do the same thing with regard to any given priest whose life is less than exemplary. But many will not. It does not change the fact that there are those who will not be able to do that, who in fact would be turned away from the faith if they see the priest being anything less than a saint, pretty much. St. Alphonsus relates a story of some heretic who was going to convert and then saw a priest saying Mass very sloppily in a very disedifying manner, and then after that refused to embrace the faith. And also there's a story, stories even closer to home than that, but there's one instance of a lady whose husband, she was Catholic, and I think she's still alive, but whose husband was not Catholic, and she was trying to get him to convert around the time of the council, and he finally agreed to it. But then the priest who was catechizing him, giving him, preparing him to embrace the faith, himself apostatized from the priesthood because of Vatican II. And so the man was so scandalized by that he decided he wasn't going to embrace the faith. And then she convinced him again, and then it happened again. The second priest apostatized also, and after that he never converted. As far as I know, he died a non-Catholic. He's been dead a long time now, but as far as I understand, he died never having embraced the faith. And probably had it not been for Vatican II and the scandal in its wake, that he probably would have converted. So it seems. So that's you should have been able to look past that. The fact that recognize you may not have been clear at the time that it was Vatican II that was the cause of that. Wasn't there. Don't know the exact circumstances. It's hard to say. But it was Vatican II, in fact, that was the problem. That should have been recognized, at least figured out. The work done to put in to figure that out. To realize that this has nothing to do with the sanctity of the priesthood in itself, or the church in itself, or the truth of the faith, or anything like that. But still, that is the kind of scandal that can be given by the bad life of a priest. So, Christ himself, the model of priests, taught first by the example of his deeds and then by his words. Jesus began to do and then to teach. That's in the Acts of the Apostles. Cepit facere et docere. Likewise, a priest who neglects his own sanctification can never be the salt of the earth. What is corrupt and contaminated is utterly incapable of preserving from corruption. Just common sense, really. And where sanctity is lacking there, in that place, corruption will inevitably find its way. Hence Christ, continuing this comparison, calls such priests salt that has lost its savor, which is good for nothing any more than to be cast out and to be trodden on by men. And that's the priest who is lacking the salt of sanctity. It is meant to preserve from corruption, salt of the earth and light of the world, leading the way by his example. And that might be a completely wordless example, at least sometimes. The example could be given without even explaining the reasons for the actions. So, in other words, if the priest is obviously, making a Thanksgiving after Mass isn't actively explaining to people why it's necessary to make a Thanksgiving after Mass. But if he's never seen making a Thanksgiving after Mass, then the people will certainly never be seen doing that either. And people like to rush out anyway, even when the priest does. Then there's no chance that many people will stick around if the priest doesn't do it. It's necessary to explain why that is to be done, when if at all possible, but also has to be professed by deeds. And that's why St. Alphonsus says that the priest should be seen carrying out his Thanksgiving, things like Thanksgiving after Mass, devotional practices. Not for purposes of vanity, but so that other people receive the example, the laity receive the example that they need. And not to make acts of piety into an occasion of ostentation, which is in fact the spirit of the devil. That is not to be the intention, but to provide the example that the people need. Do it all correctly, in a non-ostentatious manner, but one which still will be noticed, and then imitated correctly. Right. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti, men sub tuum presidium confugimus, sancta Dei genetrix nostros replicationes et spicias, in necessitatibus et repliquis contis libera nos semper, lugubrios et benedicta. Amen. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti.